Welcome to the world this week. Some 400 died last week when a garment factory collapsed in Bangladesh. The factory owner was arrested trying to flee the country even before all the bodies were recovered from the rubble. The special economic zones in which these factories are built ban trade union membership, and yet they get aid from international agencies and governments, including the British government. So should this extreme example of corporate irresponsibility lead us to question the whole sweatshop model of development? Let's take a look at this report.
When last Wednesday, ominous cracks appeared on a garment factory in Bangladesh, workers inside warned the factory's owner, who confidently insisted that his building would stand another 100 years. 45 minutes after their shift began, the building had collapsed, killing 400 and injuring many more. This was just the latest in a long string of tragedies to hit the country's garment industry. In November last year, a fire ripped through a factory just outside Dhaka, killing 100. Workers, many of which women, often work in difficult circumstances. Health and safety concerns are often flouted, whilst wages are kept low. This keeps prices down, making the Bangladesh garment industry attractive to multinationals seeking the best deals in the global marketplace. It also allows us, the consumer, to buy clothes that knock down prices. But this is controversial. Primark, a British-owned company, has admitted to making clothes in the collapsed factory, and many feel it is Western multinationals who are to blame for the pressure they put on their Bangladeshi suppliers to keep prices down, leading to corners being cut and lives put at risk. Ensuring such catastrophes do not reoccur may not be easy. There are many stakeholders in the Bangladeshi garment industry, governments, multinational companies and factory owners which have a lot at stake and so may not be willing to budge. Whilst other important players, most notably trade unions, have been largely excluded through government suppression of campaigning for workers' rights. The Pope has spoken out against what he called the slave labour conditions, whilst the European Union is reviewing its trade agreement with Bangladesh to pressure the country into complying with international labour standards. Such calls will need to be taken seriously if workers' rights are to be protected and further loss of life avoided. Amanda Thomas-Johnson, The Islam Channel.
Well, with me to discuss the issues are Alex Scrivener, Policy Officer at the World Development Movement, Clare Lissaman from the Ethical Fashion Forum, and on Skype we're joined by Benjamin Powell, Director of the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University. Welcome to the programme, everybody. So Alex, I mean, you presumably have been monitoring this kind of thing for some considerable period of time. This is hardly the first such incident, is it?
No, not at all. And the big scandal is that it's not just the companies themselves which are culpable for the situation, which they undoubtedly are. I mean, companies like Primark do hold a huge amount of responsibility for the awful conditions in which their clothes are produced. On the other hand, it's also the UK government and other governments around the world who are supporting this model of development, this sweatshop model of development. So, for example, the UK government has put in £11 million in aid money, money that's supposed to be for some of the poorest people in the world, to set up more of these special economic zones in Bangladesh, which means no rights to trade union membership, very low wages, under £1 a day for unskilled workers, and awful conditions. And when this logic and this model of development is taken to its logical conclusion, what you get are tragedies like we saw last week.
Claire, 82% of the Bangladeshi economy dependent on the garment trade. I mean, this isn't a marginal problem, is it?
No, it's 80% of Bangladesh's exports, and it's a major income earner for the country. I think what we've got to look at now is to say we know that this industry here exists with poor conditions. How do we prevent tragedies like this happening again? And the ongoing tragedy, not just of buildings collapsing and poor health and safety, but the ongoing tragedy of people working in them but not earning enough money upon which to live. And as the Ethical Fashion Forum, we're saying we need a collaborative response, the whole industry pulling together, retailers, suppliers across the industry, and we have a call to action to say never again. This should never happen again in the 21st century.
Benjamin Powell's joining us on the phone from the United States. Thanks for joining us, Benjamin. I mean, this is one example, surely, of why this sweatshop model isn't really working, at least not for the people who are at the sharp end of it.
No, actually, I think that, of course, this is a tragedy that has occurred, but it does not undermine the basic point that the, quote, sweatshop model of development is working. There's 4 million people who work in the Bangladesh garment industry. Even in so-called sweatshops that have been protested in the media in the West, The people working in those factories earn more than $2 a day, while 77% of the Bangladesh population earns less than $2 a day. There's a reason the workers come to these factories. It's because it's better than the alternatives. The safety that we see there isn't, quote, inexcusable in the 21st century. Bangladesh isn't at the level of development the United States or the United Kingdom is. They have safety conditions much more like what we did when we were at their level of economic development. As productivity rises and wages follow, then we see safety improvements. It's not the laws that do it. The laws in the UK and the United States tended to come into place and codify existing practice that had already improved because we had achieved higher productivity. When they went out in advance of that, what we found, just like in Bangladesh, is that the laws were largely ignored. So what we need is more economic development, and then we'll get more safety that will follow.
So let me see if I've got you correctly here, that because, say, British and American workers went through something like this in the 19th century, Bangladeshi workers still have to be going through it in the 21st century? I mean, surely you can see there's something a little wrong with that argument.
No, actually, nobody that I know of anywhere in the world has suggested a model of development where you skip from being a pre-industrial society to having first world living standards. What we do see is countries that have adopted this type of basically policies of economic freedom, they can grow quickly now through this stage of development. In the United States and the UK, it was a 120 to 150-year process, depending when you want to date the start and finish of it. But if you think, who were the sweatshop countries in 1960? It's Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore. What happened to them? In about a generation, they moved from pre-industrial standards up to first world standards. Because there's so much more capital and technology in the world today, they can import it to countries when you get your institutions right. So the process can be much quicker than the US or the UK went through, but it still has to happen. You can't just skip over it. And when you try to legislate yourself past it, what you end up doing is stagnating because you never attract the capital and technology that helps you grow through the stage.
So, Alex, misery and death, it's just a pathway to industrial development. Is it an argument you buy?
Not at all. I couldn't disagree more. I mean, the argument that somehow sweatshops are good for development has been thoroughly discredited. I mean, the previous person talked about $2 a day wages. The reality is that unskilled workers in Bangladesh, special economic zones, earn an average of under £1 a day. And it's not just about the wages as well. It's the fact that the UK government is effectively, by putting our aid money in these zones, subsidising companies like Nike or Primark who operate out of these areas to provide poverty wages and rid them of trade union rights, because it's not just about the money, it's about the conditions, it's about the fact that there are basic internationally recognised human rights like the right to collective bargaining, the right to be a member of a trade union, which are not recognised, not upheld by the Bangladeshi government in these zones. And these are universal rights. Unless you want to go back to the drawing board and say that basic human rights are no longer applicable, this is something we can't just put to one side.
Claire, I mean, do you think? I mean, you say the whole industry has to pull together, but whether you agree or disagree with Benjamin, it's an accurate description of what's actually happening on the ground. What do you think the chances are of turning that round?
It's sadly an accurate description, and I do disagree with Benjamin, because I think it's a vile argument to say that just because people are poor, it's okay to exploit them so that we in the West can live a nice life. I just think that's a horrendously inhuman approach to this. It might look very nice on a spreadsheet or a graph when we look across 3 centuries, but these are lives of real people here, wives, mothers, daughters. And for us to say, well, they're poor, so, they're a little bit less poor maybe if we give them really bad working conditions. That's okay, because that's the stage they have to go through. I think that's a vile and inhuman argument. But also, more importantly, Bangladeshi workers also think that's a vile and inhuman argument. And we spoke earlier this week to the Bangladesh Centre for Worker Solidarity, who say very clearly that they do see Benjamin's point that workers don't have anywhere else to go, but they say the workers themselves are not finding that a good thing. And we're seeing on the streets now in Dhaka, and we've been seeing it for years now, it's not just because of this tragedy, workers themselves standing up saying, we want to give us decent working conditions, and they will develop faster and they will overcome poverty more if they can actually be paid properly and not earn a pound a day for not just an 8-hour working day, but a 12 to 14-hour working day, which is going to cripple their bodies in the long run. And that human capital accumulation, which is how countries will develop, is not going to happen. And to do all of that off the back of us in London or New York or wherever we are being able to buy more clothes is just, we love fashion at the Ethical Fashion Forum, but it doesn't need to come off the back of breaking poor people's backs.
You see, Benjamin, what about that argument that it's not a sort of natural progress of capitalism that produces change, but it's actually these people getting whacked by successive labour revolts that actually gets them decent conditions? I mean, in your country, the upheavals of the Civil War, the creation of the AFL, the strikes in the 30s, these are the things that change people's conditions.
Yeah, no, that's not an accurate reading of history. It mostly happened after these practices were already moving through most of the industry. Of course, there were laggards. But what I must say, I find a vile argument, is to take people who have an already very limited set of options and take away what they have demonstrated by choosing to work there is their best among a bad set of options. And that's exactly what you get if you legislate higher standards than what the market will bear right now. And in fact, we saw it in Bangladesh before. There was a congressman in the United States, Tom Harkin, who proposed a bill to ban imports from Bangladesh because it was being made with child labor. Oxfam investigated, and what they found is a large number of these children became child prostitutes or starved. That's far worse than working in the garment industry. If you legislate higher...
Let me see if I've got your point right. As long as there's something worse that could happen, any form of barbarity is fine. Child labour is fine if there's something worse that could happen. Slavery is fine if there's something worse that could happen. Benjamin?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Let me see if I've got your argument right, that any form of barbarity is acceptable as long as there's something worse that could happen. Child labour is fine as long as there's something worse that could happen. Slavery is fine as long as there's something worse that could happen. I mean, is that the argument?
This is an important point. No, it's not slavery is fine as long as something worse could happen.
Where do you put the floor then? Where is your floor? Labour camps, are they all right?
In actual bondage before, these workers choose this job from a bad set of options. That choice is important. It demonstrates that we should not do something that jeopardizes that, because in the worker's own mind, it would put them into a worse option. Slavery involves taking options away from people and forcing them to do something.
So so the floor, as far as you're concerned, is only forced labour. Labour camps, slavery, that's out, but everything else.
And then the floor becomes the competition between firms for workers.
Okay, so what about the race to the bottom then?
Well, the race to the bottom is a tragedy, and the fact that with increasing globalisation across the world, companies have been able to take advantage of very low wage conditions in other countries and an awful sort of safety requirements to do this is a tragedy, and it's nothing short of that. And I think to say that these people in Bangladesh have a choice, I mean, I'm sorry, but for me, the choice between working a 15-hour day on the equivalent of 70p wages a day is not a choice. It's not a choice I'd want to have for anyone on the planet, whether they be in Bangladesh or in the UK. So I think the argument that this is somehow good for their development is I think, completely false, and there's no evidence for it whatsoever.
Clare, on this issue? I
think this is where Benjamin and I are disagreeing, that the choice between a very poor life and a poor life is what he's basically arguing for, and we're saying that the choice shouldn't be between a very poor conditions and poor conditions. The choice should be between very poor conditions and decent conditions. And fundamentally, we're saying that's not just what we're saying, that's what the workers themselves are saying. That's what they want their choice to be. That's what Bangladeshi law says. That's what consumers here are saying. That's even what the retailers are saying. And for all that Western retailers have been slammed recently in the media for this, and deservedly so, are being asked to step up and take responsibility, they're also saying, they've been saying to the Bangladeshi government, you need to reconvene the minimum wage board. You need to do this across an industry, because it is quite hard for us as individual retailers or the suppliers to do it single-handedly. And as an industry, if you do this, we will carry on buying from you. That's what they've been saying. Some of them have been saying. So I think that's really important. The choice should never be between a horrendous life and a slightly less horrendous one, if we have the opportunity to make that less horrendous one a bit better, and we do.
Benjamin, just to go back to your example, I mean, you said that, you know, when there were complaints about child labour, it was investigated, and it was found that actually, without child labour, people were forced into child prostitution. Is that what you mean by people are choosing to work in these factories? Because if that's what you mean, if you're given the choice between child prostitution and child labour, that's a free choice in only the most nominal and constricted sense of the word, isn't it?
They live in a constricted world, so economics puts limits on our utopia.
No, hang on a minute. If you want to work at Sainsbury's or Morrison's or Ford, that's one choice. The choice between child prostitution and child labour is another choice, isn't it? Benjamin?
Yes, I'm sorry.
I'm saying that you're not comparing like with like. If you choose to work at Ford or Honda or in the local supermarket, that's one form of labour market choice. The choice between child prostitution and child labour isn't a choice in the same sense at all.
Perhaps I'm being unclear here. The limitation is if you do something else, they put in a minimum wage, you take away the option of working in the factory, and now they really don't have a choice. I'm talking about we need to do things that expand their choice set. Unfortunately, I think most calls for activism of mandating increased safety or higher wages will result in taking away their best bad option. That results in less choice, and I find it truly vile.
And I think we're saying that you can do that without it taking away their best bad option, but actually making it a good option. But the industry has to come together as a collaborative industry. Retailers working with their suppliers, saying, how can we make this work? And there are shining examples of how good practice can be done. The fair trade model, People Tree have been sourcing from Bangladesh for years, showing that you can source responsibly, and that these women who are moving from rural areas to come and work in the garment industry and just kind of be ignored, they're just a worker. They actually have amazing skill sets, amazing intelligence, amazing ability to give. And when we just look at things about the minimum sort of financial poverty they're living in, that's one thing. But we have to look beyond financial poverty as well. And people's increased income when they come into the cities does not always reflect an increased living standard. In fact, quite often they find themselves more impoverished when they are working for an increased wage because living costs are much more expensive in the city. They can be far more abused. It's mainly a female-dominated industry run by men, and I think there's a whole cultural issue here. And I'm sure viewers will understand this more than I do around how that's operating. And these women can really suffer, even if it looks on paper as if they may be getting a little bit more money. Their actual overall poverty is not necessarily improving.
Do you think that the development model is actually lifting people out of poverty or not?
Well, I think the first thing that needs to happen is the UK government needs to stop supporting negative development models. So the UK government needs to stop putting money into special economic zones in Bangladesh and start diverting aid towards projects which actually do some good on the ground. And, you know, there's lots of... I mean, aid is not the answer to all the world's problems at all. I mean, we need to have a much fairer trade relationship with much of the developing world for that to happen. But aid does have a role to play in terms of increasing people's living standards, and to divert that money, which you know everyone in the UK wants to go to some of the world's poorest people to improve their living standards, and putting that in the pockets essentially of multinational companies who are abusing their workers is, I think, abominable.
How much of a lever is it? How much British government aid is actually channeled into these development zones, and how much of an impact would it have if the government would say, "Come on, this is unacceptable"?
Well, from the UK's perspective, from this particular project, it's £11 million. But that's not the only project that the UK government is pursuing. I mean, overall, we've seen a shift in UK government policy on aid towards more private sector-oriented projects. So that means instead of support for schools, public hospitals, and all the traditional recipients of aid, which actually are there on the ground and actually create a better life for people, we're seeing aid increasingly diverted to private companies. So you'll see aid be given to the Nike Foundation. You'll see aid being put into special economic zones or into tax advice to help companies invest in places like Bangladesh. And what this does is diverting money, which is supposed to be helping the poor, to multinationals. And this development model of the race to the bottom, which is something that we end up with the results that we've seen in Bangladesh.
Claire, do you think there's a specific role for people in this country or in other Western countries that they can play in terms of pushing this kind of agenda?
Yes, I think we're all consumers, but some of us also work for fashion labels for brands that are sourcing from those countries, and our individual agency in this is really important. Making it known, retailers respond to what they think or they know their customers want, and so making that known by talking to them, by telling them. Obviously, you can make it known by where you move and where you shop and don't shop, and looking for specific brands who are saying what they're doing. So making yourself aware, informed, and making informed buying decisions can make a huge difference. But also, most people, if you're working in a company that's sourcing from this, use that role as well, and say, you know, this is a company I'm working for. I want to see what we're doing and improve stuff. As we said, it has to be a collaborative approach across the industry.
I mean, this is a question which, you know, I mean, we're focusing on Bangladesh because of the collapse of the garment factory, but I mean, it's also a massive question in China, for instance. The same, and the Chinese government is having to deal with successive waves of labour unrest, isn't it? Do you think that what workers do in these areas is perhaps the most important driver here? Because Bangladesh has a long history of trade union and labour militancy.
I mean, yes, I think the role of activists on the ground, the role of trade unions on the ground is very strong, and I think it's very important that people who care about this issue in the global north, people who live in rich countries like the UK, stand in solidarity and support the trade union movements and the sort of local activists and the people who are at the fire, the coalface, I suppose, of the exploitation that's going on in Bangladesh. But at the same time, I think we need to also be targeting government. I mean, we can talk about consumer activism, which is very effective sometimes, you know, making it very well known to companies like Primark that they can't get away with what they're getting away with currently. But at the same time, we also need to target our own governments and make sure that there is strong enough regulation in place to make sure that companies like Primark can't source clothes and materials like that from unethical sources.
Benjamin, let me bring you back in here, because I mean, you've made a great deal of play on the idea that that these workers have individual choice. Are you in favour of their individual choice to join a trade union, which they're currently banned from doing in these areas?
Yeah, so let me be clear about this, and I'll relate it to China that you just mentioned. China, of course, is the greatest success over the last decade. Of no time in human history have more people been lifted out of poverty than what's gone on in China in the last decade, and that's largely this low-wage industrialization model of economic development that's gone on there. There has been other government interventions, but the main thing is this factory system taking people into so-called sweatshop jobs and advancing them up. It's been a tremendous success at lifting people out of poverty.
But it's a completely state-directed model, isn't it? The Chinese industrial development is completely state-directed.
No, not at all. I mean,
yes, it is.
Still very state-directed, but in terms of improvements in economic freedom, China's been the biggest reformer since 1980 in all of Asia. It's made much more reform than people who nominally dropped communism. So it's a mistake to think of them as a state-directed model.
But the economic zones are state-directed industry.
Now, the trade union part, let's just be clear, though. When we study the differences of wages across nations, about 77% of the difference in productivity is what explains, about 77% of the difference in wages is explained by productivity differences. So that means the real game is making labor more productive. At best, what trade unionism could hope to accomplish at best would be that 23% deviation between that's unexplained. That's the upper bound of what that possibly could be. So the lion's share of this game here is productivity growth and economic development.
Well, Alex, I mean, that margin may sound small to Benjamin, but if you were living on the money, it might seem rather large.
Well, I mean, of course, people like Benjamin like to talk about labour productivity and all of these kind of terms. What that really means is sucking as much production out of workers for as little money as possible. And it's not efficiency, that's just exploitation. So I think I need to sort of take issue with the language that's being used. You know, it's very easy to couch that exploitation in quite sort of technical language, when in fact that's what's going on. You know, increasing labour productivity, increasing efficiency is in fact often the code words for increasing exploitation. And I think it's important that people know that that's what's being talked about.
Okay.
I was working in China a lot in the mid-90s when the factories were really being thrown up, particularly in southern China. And I think what you saw there is inefficient, badly run, poorly run factories making money off the fact that they had cheap labour. So they didn't need to run a good factory. You had very unqualified people setting up businesses. Because labour was cheap, they could get away with running stuff quite badly and still selling it at a price that customers wanted.
I'm going to stop you there because we've run out of time, but thanks to my guests in the studio and to my guests from America on the phone. Do join us for the second part of The World This Week.